The night Dorothy Doyle knocked on the door of the Redemption Creek Chapel, she had blood on her sleeve, a bruise rising purple along her jaw, and exactly nowhere left to run. The Kansas wind had teeth in October of 1878, and it bit through her thin wool dress as if the fabric were paper. She had been walking for 3 hours through the dark, following the road out of Harlan's Crossing by memory and desperation alone, her boots wearing holes in the bottoms of her feet, her breath coming in shallow, frightened gasps. Behind her, somewhere in the blackness of the prairie, Wade Calloway was probably still drinking. But she knew from hard experience that men like Wade did not stay drunk forever, and when he sobered enough to notice she was gone, he would come looking. Men like Wade always came looking. The chapel sat at the edge of Redemption Creek like something God had dropped there on purpose, a small white-painted building with a modest cross above the door and a lamp burning in the window of the attached house beside it. Dorothy stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a long moment, her hand pressed to her side where a cracked rib made every breath a small private agony, and she looked at that light the way a drowning woman looks at a rope. She climbed the steps. She knocked. There was a long silence, then the sound of floorboards creaking beneath boots, then the scrape of a latch being drawn back. The door opened, and Reuben Finley stood in the frame with a candle in one hand and sleep still heavy in his eyes, wearing a plain flannel shirt with the collar unbuttoned and dark trousers hastily pulled on, his dark hair disheveled from the pillow. He was 29 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble and eyes the color of winter bark, deep brown and steady. He took one look at Dorothy and the candle flame wavered as his whole body went still. "Lord above," he said quietly, not an exclamation, a prayer. "I need sanctuary," Dorothy said, and her voice was astonishingly calm for a woman who was shaking from her crown to her boots. "I have read that a church is supposed to be a sanctuary. I need to know if that is still true." Reuben Finley stepped back from the doorway without a word and held the door open. She walked inside. The attached house was plain but clean, a main room with a stone fireplace still holding coals from the evening, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, shelves of books, a Bible open on the desk in the corner. There was a kerosene lamp on the table and the warm smell of wood smoke and something like coffee, though the pot had long since gone cold. Dorothy stood in the center of the room and let the warmth begin to chip at the cold that had settled into her bones. And for a moment she did not speak, because she was afraid that if she opened her mouth she would simply come apart. Reuben set the candle on the table and crossed to the fireplace and crouched down and began feeding it kindling without asking her anything. His movements were efficient and unhurried, as if a woman appearing at his door at midnight with a bruised face were something he handled with quiet grace every time it happened. When the fire caught and began to climb, he stood and turned and looked at her properly in the growing light, and she saw his jaw tighten slightly when he took in the full extent of what she was carrying on her body. "Sit down," he said gently. "Please." Dorothy sat in the nearest chair and felt her legs give with relief they hadn't been allowed to feel for 3 hours of walking. "I'll heat some water," Reuben said. "There are things in the medicine chest for that cut above your eye. Do you want to tell me your name?" "Dorothy Doyle," she said. "Reuben Finley," he said. "I am the preacher here, have been for 2 years." He filled a small iron pot from the water bucket near the hearth and set it over the fire. "Who did this to you, Miss Doyle?" "My husband," she said, and then caught herself. The man I was married to, Wade Calloway. He goes by Calloway because Doyle was my father's name and I never gave it up even after the wedding, which he never forgave me for." She paused. "Among other things." Reuben pulled the second chair close to hers and sat down across from her. His elbows rested on his knees and he looked at her directly, not with pity, which she would have hated, but with a focused and serious attention that felt like being truly seen for the first time in a very long while. "How long?" he asked. 3 years of marriage," she said. "The first 6 months were bearable, after that not so much." She looked at her hands in her lap. I know what people think about women who stay. I want you to know I tried to leave twice before. The first time he found me at my cousin's house in Abilene and brought me back. The second time I got as far as the stage depot in Larimer and he was already there waiting because he had guessed I would try it and rode ahead. She lifted her eyes. Tonight he was drunk enough that I had a window. I took it. You did the right thing, Reuben said, and he said it simply and without hesitation, the way a man states a fact he has no doubt about whatsoever. Something in those 4 words made Dorothy's eyes sting in a way that 3 hours of walking through the cold dark had not. She looked away quickly. He will come looking, she said. When he sobers up, he will come to every door in Redemption Creek asking questions. He will come here. I know, Reuben said. He rose and went to the medicine chest on the shelf near the window, a flat wooden box, and brought it back and opened it on the table beside her. He wet a clean cloth in the hot water he poured into a basin and turned to her face, and his hands were steady and careful as he cleaned the cut above her brow. Dorothy held very still and breathed through her nose and kept her eyes on the middle distance. You are not what I expected, she said after a while. What did you expect? Someone who would tell me that marriage is a sacred covenant and send me back. Reuben's hands paused for just a moment, then continued. I believe marriage is a sacred covenant, he said. I also believe that covenant requires 2 people to honor it. A man who uses his hands on his wife has broken something that cannot be mended by returning her to him. He dipped the cloth again. There is nothing in Scripture that requires a woman to stand in front of a fist and call it devotion. Dorothy looked at him then directly and found that he was already looking at her, his eyes steady and certain, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 3 years loosened by a single painful notch. Where will I sleep? She asked, because it was a practical question and she was a practical woman. You will take the bed in there, Reuben said, nodding toward the door off the main room. It is the only bedroom. I will sleep here in front of the fire. I have done it before. I cannot take your bed. Miss Doyle, he said, and a faint hint of something warm and dry crossed his face, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one. You walked 3 hours through an October night with a cracked rib. You will take the bed, she blinked. How did you know about the rib? The way you are holding yourself, he said. I have seen it before. I was a field medic for 18 months before I took holy orders. Breathe shallow and do not lift your arms above your shoulders for a few days. He handed her a small bottle. This is laudanum, just a few drops in water if the pain is too much to sleep. Do not take more than that. Dorothy took the bottle and looked at it and then looked at him. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because you knocked on my door and asked for sanctuary, he said, as if the answer were the simplest thing in the world. And because I have a door to open. She slept in his bed that night, in her dress, under 2 heavy quilts that smelled of wood smoke and cedar, and she slept without dreaming for the first time in longer than she could remember. The cracked rib throbbed with every breath, and the cut above her eye was tender, and the bruise on her jaw was turning colors she would not like to see in daylight. But she was warm and she was still, and no one knew exactly where she was, and those 3 things together were almost indistinguishable from peace. Reuben sat in the chair by the fire for a long time after she had gone to bed, the Bible open in his lap but unread, the fire settling into quiet orange coals. He stared into the glow and turned the evening over in his mind. This woman with her calm, careful voice and her extraordinary composure, and the way her eyes had gone bright for just a moment when he had said she had done the right thing. There was something about Dorothy Doyle that caught in his chest like a splinter, small and persistent, and impossible to ignore. He told himself that was not the sort of thing he ought to be thinking about, and then he went ahead and thought it anyway, because he was only a man, and she was something genuinely remarkable. The morning came in gray and cold, and Reuben was already up and had coffee boiling and cornbread baking in the Dutch oven over the fire when he heard the bedroom door open and Dorothy appeared in the doorway. In the daylight, the bruise on her jaw was deep purple edged with green, and the cut above her eye had scabbed over cleanly, and her dark hair had come partially loose from its pins, and fell in a soft wave along one side of her face. She was wearing yesterday's dress and she looked both wrecked and wholly herself, and Reuben turned his attention very deliberately to the coffee. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning. Sit down. How is the rib?" "Manageable," she said, and sat down at the table. She looked around the room in the daylight with a focused, appraising look, as if cataloging the details. "You have a great many books for a man living on a preacher's salary." "Books are the one thing I have never been willing to go without," he said. He poured her coffee and set a tin cup in front of her. "Most of them came with me from Missouri. A few I have traded for here and there." He glanced at her. "Do you read?" "Voraciously," she said. "My father was a schoolteacher in Iowa. We had 140 books in our house when I was growing up. I have read every one of them at least twice." She paused. "Wade burned most of them. He said books made women argumentative." Reuben set a plate of cornbread on the table and sat down across from her. "He was probably right," he said, "in the best possible sense." Dorothy looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, and that almost smile crossed her face, careful and small, as if she were not quite sure yet whether she was allowed to be amused. "You are an unusual preacher, Mr. Finley." "I have been told that before," he said, "usually not as a compliment." "I meant it as one," she said quietly, and went back to her coffee. The question of Wade Calloway arrived before 9 o'clock in the morning, announced by the sound of a horse at a hard canter pulling up in front of the chapel and heavy boots hitting the porch boards. Reuben was on his feet before the knock, and he caught Dorothy's eye across the table and said quietly but with absolute calm, "Stay in the bedroom. Do not come out." She rose without argument and was through the door, and had it shut softly behind her before the second knock fell. Reuben opened the front door. Wade Calloway was a thick-set man of about 35 with a face like a clenched fist, reddish from years of sun and drink, with small eyes set too close together and a mouth that seemed to exist primarily for sneering. He was wearing a trail coat and a holster at his hip, and he smelled of last night's whiskey still working its way through his pores. He looked at Reuben with those close-set eyes and said, "I'm looking for my wife, Dorothy. Dark hair about this tall. She run off last night, and someone in town said they saw a woman walking this direction." "I see a great many people in the course of a week," Reuben said pleasantly. He leaned against the door frame with his arms loosely crossed. He was taller than Calloway by 2 inches, and his broad shoulders filled the frame, and he kept his expression easy and unhurried and entirely unrevealing. "What is your name, friend?" "Wade Calloway. Now have you seen her or not?" "I have not seen a woman fitting that description come to this chapel, Mr. Calloway," Reuben said. He had prayed about what he would do when this moment came, between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning while Dorothy slept. He had arrived at the position that protecting an innocent life was worth whatever moral complexity came with it, and that God, who knew every situation in its full particularity, would understand that better than any rigid rule could. He said it without flinching because he believed it. Calloway stared at him. "You're a preacher." "I am. And you're telling me on your word as a man of God that my wife ain't here." "I am telling you," Reuben said, "that no woman has come to this chapel, which is the truth." He held the man's gaze steadily. The house was separate from the chapel. The distinction was technically real, and Reuben was aware that it was a very fine line, but he stood on it and did not waver. Calloway looked at him for a long, calculating moment, and Reuben could see the man trying to decide whether a preacher would lie to his face. Most people, he knew, assumed they would not. It was one of the few advantages the collar afforded. "If she shows up," Calloway said, "you send word to me at the saloon in Harlan's Crossing. She is my wife and she belongs home." "If a woman in distress comes to this door seeking help," Reuben said, still pleasant, still steady, "I will help her. That is the only promise I am in a position to make." Something shifted in Calloway's eyes, a flash of ugly comprehension, and for a moment Reuben thought the man was going to push through the door. Then Calloway stepped back, his jaw working, and spat in the dirt beside the porch steps. "Interfering busybody preacher," he said, and climbed back onto his horse and rode off at a pace that made the animal's hooves throw clods of earth against the fence. Reuben stood in the doorway and watched until he was out of sight around the bend in the road, and then he closed the door and went to the bedroom door and knocked once. "He is gone," he said. The door opened and Dorothy stood there with her arms wrapped around herself and her face composed into a careful stillness that he was beginning to understand was her way of managing things that frightened her. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Reuben said. "That no woman had come to the chapel. He met her eyes, which was true. You came to the house." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. "That is an extraordinary interpretation of the truth, Mr. Finley." "It is," he agreed. "I spent several hours last night determining that it was one I could live with." He crossed to the fireplace and moved the coffee pot closer to the heat. "He will be back. Not today, perhaps, but soon. And when he comes back, he will bring other men and he will be less polite about it. You need to understand that." "I understand it," she said. She came into the main room and sat down again at the table. "What do I do?" "That," Reuben said, turning to face her, "is exactly what I was thinking about when I came to the conclusion I need to tell you." He pulled the other chair out and sat down, and folded his hands on the table with the air of a man who has made a decision, and is going to stand behind it with everything he has. "In this territory, under current law, a wife is the legal property of her husband. He can come to this door with the county sheriff and demand you be returned to him, and there is very little legally that I can do to prevent it. There is only one shield I know of that would give you true protection." Dorothy's eyes were steady on his face. "Tell me." "If you were married to someone else," Reuben said, "he could not claim you. A man cannot seize another man's wife under the law without it becoming a matter for the courts, and courts take time, and time gives you options." He paused. "I am proposing that we marry. Today, before he comes back with papers or deputies. I am a licensed minister in this county, and in Kansas, a minister may perform his own ceremony provided there is a witness. Old Henry Marsh, who keeps the hardware store 2 miles down the road, has witnessed 3 of my ceremonies and would not ask too many questions before sunrise." The silence that followed was absolute except for the soft popping of the fire. Dorothy stared at him. "You are asking me to marry you," she said slowly. "A woman you have known for approximately 8 hours. "I am asking you to let me give you my name," Reuben said, and his voice was quiet and entirely serious. "It is not a conventional proposal. I understand that. I am not asking you to love me, Miss Doyle. I am asking you to let me protect you, because it is the only way I know to do it that will actually work. The rest," he said carefully, "can be whatever you decide it ought to be, on whatever timeline seems right, or never, if that is your determination." Dorothy was quiet for a very long time. She looked at the fire and then at the shelves of books and then at her own hands on the table, and Reuben waited with the patience of a man who has learned that the most important moments require room to breathe. "You would do this," she finally said. "Bind yourself to a woman you do not know, take on the legal and social complications that come with it, because a stranger knocked on your door." "I would do this," Reuben said, "because I believe God puts people in front of each other for reasons, and because the law of this territory is unjust in the way it treats women, and because you walked 3 hours through an October night rather than spend another night in that house, and I believe that kind of courage deserves to be answered with something equally committed." He held her gaze. "And because, Miss Doyle, in 8 hours of knowing you, I find that I admire you enormously, which is more than most men can say about people they have known for years." Dorothy looked at him then in a way that made something in his chest constrict with the weight of it, a clear, searching look that seemed to be measuring the full depth of what he had said, and finding that it reached all the way to the bottom. "All right," she said. "Yes." Reuben rose from the table. "I will ride out to Henry's and be back within the hour," he said. "There is more cornbread in the Dutch oven and more coffee in the pot." "Reuben," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both heard it. He stopped at the door and looked back. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, and went out into the morning. Henry Marsh was 62 years old, a widower with a long gray beard and a practical disposition honed by 40 years of living in places where the practical was the only thing standing between you and catastrophe. He listened to Reuben's explanation with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth and his eyebrows ascending steadily, and when Reuben finished, Henry put the cup down and said, "Son, you know this is going to cause a tremendous amount of trouble." "I know," Reuben said. "Calloway will not take it quietly." "I know that too." Henry looked at him for a moment with those old, clear eyes that had seen a great deal of the world. "Do you care for her?" Reuben thought about Dorothy sitting at his table in the firelight with her composure wrapped around her like armor and her eyes going briefly brilliant when he told her she had done the right thing. "Yes," he said. "In the way that matters, yes." Henry stood up and went to get his coat. "Well then," he said, "let us go be a witness." The ceremony happened in Reuben's small kitchen, while the morning light came in through the east window in long flat bars of gold. And Henry Marsh stood beside the table, with the witness's ledger open in his hands, while Reuben and Dorothy stood facing each other on the worn plank floor. Dorothy had smoothed her hair back and straightened her dress, and she stood very straight, which must have hurt the cracked rib, but she gave no sign of it. Her dark eyes were clear and steady, and she held Reuben's gaze throughout. Reuben spoke the words he had spoken at a dozen other ceremonies, the old familiar words of covenant and promise, but they had never before felt like this, like something he was saying directly to a particular human being about a particular human being, words weighted with the full gravity of what they actually meant. He watched Dorothy's face as he spoke and saw nothing in it that suggested hesitation, only that focused stillness that he was learning to recognize as her form of deep attention. When it was Dorothy's turn to speak, she said the words clearly and without stumbling, her voice carrying the same quality it had had at midnight when she stood on his porch and asked for sanctuary, calm and precise, and underpinned by something absolutely unbreakable. Henry signed the ledger, and Reuben signed it, and Dorothy signed it, and Henry Marsh looked at the two of them and shook his head slowly in something between disbelief and deep approval. "Dorothy Finley," he said. "It is a good name. Dorothy Finley." She tried it quietly in her head as Henry rode back down the road and Reuben stood in the kitchen doorway watching him go, and she found that it fit differently than Dorothy Calloway had ever fit, as if it had been made for her rather than imposed on her. "What happens now?" she asked. Reuben turned from the doorway. "Now we go about the day," he said. "I have a sermon to prepare for Sunday. You are welcome to the books, the kitchen, anything you find here." He paused. "And sometime before the end of the week, Wade Calloway will hear about this and come back, and we will deal with it together." She looked at him. "Together," she repeated. "Together," he said simply, and went to his desk. The days that followed had a quality that Dorothy found difficult to name. They were not comfortable exactly, because comfort implies familiarity, and she and Reuben were two strangers learning each other across the architecture of a shared small house. But they were good. Surprisingly, persistently, quietly good in a way she had nearly forgotten was possible. She learned that Reuben rose before dawn every morning and sat at his desk for an hour with his Bible and a notebook before he did anything else, and that he made coffee that was strong enough to put hair on iron and saw no reason to apologize for it. She learned that he had grown up in St. Joseph, Missouri, the third of 5 children of a farmer and a schoolteacher, and that his mother had given him his love of books and his father had given him his stubbornness, and that he had studied for 2 years at a seminary in Kansas City before a crisis of faith had sent him west where, as he put it, the rawness of the landscape seemed to make God more legible rather than less. She learned that he could be very funny in a dry, understated way that caught her off guard regularly, and that he took the concerns of his congregation with a seriousness that was entirely genuine, and that when he was thinking hard about something, he had a habit of running his thumb along the edge of whatever book was nearest to him, wearing a small groove in the page corners. In return, She told him about Iowa and her father's schoolroom, and the winter she had read all of Dickens before she was 14. She told him about coming to Kansas at 19 with a modest inheritance and a great deal of confidence in her own judgment, which had led her, through a sequence of events she dissected with something approaching clinical honesty, to marrying Wade Calloway. She had been lonely and he had been charming for exactly as long as it had taken to secure the marriage, and by the time she understood what lay beneath the charm, the law had made her his. Reuben listened to all of this with his full attention, and without the flinching sympathy she had always found unbearable, that particular quality of pity that made you feel reduced rather than understood. He listened the way a person listens when they are genuinely interested in the truth of something, asking occasional precise questions, and when she finished, he said, "The failure was not in your judgment, it was in his character. Those are two different things." "Most people do not see them as different," she said. "Most people are wrong," he said, and went back to his book. She was in love with him by Wednesday. She recognized it with a kind of amused despair, sitting at his kitchen table on the fourth morning of their acquaintance reading one of his books, and listening to him in the next room working through a passage of scripture aloud in the way he apparently did when writing a sermon, his voice low and thoughtful, and carrying a conviction that was nothing like performance. She looked at the page she wasn't reading and thought, well, that is inconvenient. It was inconvenient because it was too fast, and because the situation they were in was complicated enough without her feelings becoming a factor, and because she was keenly aware that he had offered her his name as a protection and a kindness, not a courtship, and she did not want to be the kind of woman who confused those two things and made something embarrassing out of an act of generosity. She closed the book and made more coffee and was very sensible about it. Reuben was in love with her by Thursday. He recognized it with less amused despair and more simple certainty, the way he sometimes recognized the answer to a theological question he had been working on for months, not a lightning bolt, but a quiet opening of understanding. He had been washing the breakfast dishes when it happened, which seemed an undignified setting for the revelation, and Dorothy had been at the table reading with her chin propped in one hand and her dark hair slightly disheveled from the morning, and she had said something sharp and funny about the author she was reading, and he had laughed, and the sound of his own laughter and the sight of her small, pleased smile at having caused it had opened something in his chest that he understood was not going to close again. He went on washing the dishes and was very practical about it. The town of Redemption Creek had opinions, as small towns in Kansas in 1878 reliably did. Some were admiring. Several of Reuben's congregation members arrived at the house over those first days, bearing food and cautious goodwill, women mostly, who had seen enough of the world to understand what had happened and why, and who clasped Dorothy's hands with the particular warm solidarity of women who have watched other women suffer unjust things. Mrs. Edna Pratchett, who was 60 and had been running the town's small boarding house for 20 years, arrived on Thursday morning with a pot of venison stew and said to Dorothy, with the directness of someone who has long since stopped wasting time, "You have done a brave thing, and Reuben Finley is a good man, and I hope you will both be very happy," and then pressed Dorothy's hand and left without waiting for a response. Some members of the town were less charitable. There was talk in certain quarters about the indecency of a preacher marrying a married woman, though technically, under the previous marriage having been conducted in Missouri before Dorothy relocated to Kansas, and with the circumstances being what they were, the legal ground was less certain than it appeared. Reuben had written a letter to the county clerk in Hayes on the first day, setting out the facts with careful legal clarity, and he had also written to a lawyer he knew in Kansas City, a man named Albright who specialized in exactly these kinds of contested domestic situations. He did not tell Dorothy all of this because he did not want her to feel that her security depended on paperwork and lawyers. He simply made the arrangements quietly because that was how he operated. Wade Calloway came back on Friday afternoon. He came with two men, friends of his from Harlan's Crossing, large weather-beaten cowboys who looked as if they had been chosen for their size and their willingness not to ask questions. He also came with a piece of paper that he waved from the back of his horse like a flag of conquest, and he was sober this time, which made him considerably more dangerous. Reuben was on the porch when they rode up. He had his hat on and his arms were crossed, and he had known they were coming because Henry Marsh had sent his boy running down the road 20 minutes earlier with the warning. Dorothy was inside, at his insistence, though she had argued about it with a clear-eyed practicality that he had found both admirable and deeply frustrating. Calloway pulled his horse up at the fence and held up the paper. "I have a writ from Justice Morrow in Harlan's Crossing," he said. "It orders the return of my wife, Dorothy, to the marital home." "You can get off your horse and come speak to me properly," Reuben said, "or you can stay up there and shout. But I am going to tell you what I need to tell you regardless." Calloway stared at him for a moment, then dismounted with a studied deliberateness and came to the fence. His two men stayed on their horses. Reuben stepped down from the porch to the fence, keeping the rails between them, and the morning light was very clear, and the Kansas prairie stretched out behind them in every direction, vast and silent and indifferent to human quarrels. "Dorothy Calloway is my wife," Calloway said, jabbing the writ at him. "This paper says so. That writ was issued on the basis of a marriage that predates your presence in Kansas," Reuben said, and he kept his voice level and clear. "I was married to Dorothy Doyle this past Monday morning before sunrise, in the presence of a licensed witness, and that marriage was recorded in the county register. I have already written to the court in Hayes to establish the priority of the more recent registration. Until the court makes a determination, your writ has no force in this county." Calloway's face went through several colors. "That is bigamy," he said. "You married a married woman." "The question of the validity of your marriage," Reuben said, "is precisely what I have asked the court in Hayes to determine. Given the circumstances under which Dorothy left your house, circumstances which I have set out in considerable detail in my letter, and which Henry Marsh and 3 other residents of this town are prepared to attest to, I believe the court will look upon the matter favorably." He met Calloway's eyes without blinking. "You are welcome to take that to a judge if you believe you are in the right. Courts have their own opinions about men who use their wives as punching bags." Calloway's hand moved toward his hip. "I would not do that," Reuben said quietly. He had not moved, had not shifted his weight or changed his posture in any way, but something in his voice had changed, a quality of bedrock, immovable and without heat. "Not because I will stop you with force, though I am prepared to do that if necessary, but because there are 3 people in the buildings along this road who are watching this exchange right now, and a minister of God dead on his own doorstep for the crime of sheltering a woman is the kind of story that reaches Hayes very quickly and does not end well for the man who caused it." Calloway's hand stilled. "Go see a judge, Mr. Calloway," Reuben said. "That is your right and I encourage you to use it. But take your men and go, and do not come to this property again without a lawful court order, or I will have the county sheriff here before you reach the county line." There was a long, taut silence. A hawk turned in slow circles above the buffalo grass somewhere to the west, and the horses shifted and blew, and the 2 men behind Calloway exchanged a look. Then Calloway took his writ and folded it with sharp, furious precision, and tucked it inside his coat, and turned and mounted his horse without another word and rode away, and his 2 men followed him, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the great flat quiet of the Kansas morning. Reuben stood at the fence for a moment after they had gone, and then he went inside. Dorothy was standing in the middle of the main room with her arms wrapped around herself, her face very still and her dark eyes full of something she was managing with visible effort. "I heard most of it," she said. "Good," Reuben said. He took his hat off and hung it on the peg by the door. "Then you know where we stand." "He will go to a court," she said, "probably, and we will deal with it then." He crossed to the fire and checked the coffee pot. "How is the rib?" She stared at him. You just faced down Wade Calloway and 2 hired men at your fence, and the first thing you ask me about is my rib." "Your rib is a thing I can directly address," he said. "The court proceedings in Hayes are a thing that will unfold on their own timetable. I prefer to deal with the immediate problem." He turned and found that she had crossed the room and was standing much closer than he expected, close enough that he could see the way the morning light caught the gold in her dark eyes, and the small, precise lines of her face, and the way she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen there before. "Reuben," she said, and her voice was low and careful, "I want you to know something." "All right," he said. "I agreed to this arrangement because it was the most practical means of protection available to me in the middle of the night in a desperate situation," she said. "That is the truth. But I also want you to know that in 4 days of knowing you, I have come to—" She stopped and reset her footing, and he saw her gathering something. "I have come to care about you in a way that has nothing to do with practicality or legal arrangements. And I think you should know that, because you have been extraordinarily kind to me and honest with me, and I think honesty deserves to be answered with honesty." Reuben looked at her for a long moment. The fire snapped behind him and the wind pressed against the side of the house, and the whole wide prairie was out there beyond the walls, and in the small warm room it was very quiet. "Dorothy," he said, and his voice was low, "I rode out Monday morning to get Henry Marsh, and I told him I cared for you. He asked me directly, and I told him yes in the way that matters. And I had known you for 8 hours. He paused. "So whatever you are trying to tell me, I am already on that road." She looked at him, and the careful composure that had been her permanent expression for 4 days shifted, not collapsed but opened, like a window letting in light, and her eyes went bright and direct, and the small almost smile arrived and widened into something real and full and unutterably beautiful. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair back from the bruised side of her face, with a gentleness so deliberate it barely qualified as a touch, and she tilted her face toward his hand the small involuntary way a person moves toward warmth, and they stood like that for a moment in the firelight of a Friday morning in October, in a small house on the Kansas prairie. 2 people who had arrived at each other by the strangest possible road and found themselves, in spite of everything, exactly where they were supposed to be. He kissed her very gently because of the bruise and because she was still healing and because some things deserved to be done carefully, and she kissed him back with a warmth that surprised and undid him completely. And when they drew back, she had her hands on the front of his shirt and her forehead rested briefly against his chest, and she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh but something in between, the sound of a person setting down a very heavy weight. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. In the weeks that followed, the legal situation with Wade Calloway wound its way through the system with the grinding slowness of frontier justice. Reuben's letter reached the court in Hayes, and Albright the lawyer came out from Kansas City in November and spent 3 days meeting with Reuben and Dorothy and reviewing the situation. He was a compact, precise man in his late 40s with quick eyes and a methodical manner, and he read the situation carefully and told them that they had a strong case, particularly given the testimony of multiple witnesses to the injuries Dorothy had sustained and the documented pattern of Calloway's behavior in the Harlan's Crossing area, which Reuben had been quietly gathering since the Monday morning after Dorothy arrived. Calloway did attempt his legal challenge. He hired a lawyer from Hayes who argued that the Finley marriage was invalid under Missouri law given the existence of the prior marriage. But Albright argued in return that the Missouri marriage had been conducted under conditions of fraud and coercion, citing specific documentation, and that Dorothy had relocated to Kansas as an independent citizen before the subsequent marriage. The judge, a pragmatic man named Hollander who had been hearing cases in this county for 15 years, was not unsympathetic to the argument. He was also, critically, the kind of judge who had grown weary of husbands who appeared in his courtroom treating their wives as property to be recovered rather than persons to be reconciled. The hearing was held in Hayes in December, and Reuben and Dorothy rode the 30 miles in a rented wagon with Albright and Henry Marsh, who testified with the plain directness of a man who has nothing to prove and nowhere to be except telling the truth. Dorothy testified too, and she was remarkable on the stand, speaking in that calm, clear voice about the 3 years of her first marriage with a precision and dignity that left the courtroom very quiet. Reuben sat in the gallery and watched her and felt a pride so fierce it almost hurt. Judge Hollander ruled that the Missouri marriage had been invalidated by documented grounds of cruelty, that Dorothy had the right to establish independent legal status upon relocating to Kansas as a territory, and that the subsequent marriage to Reuben Finley was valid and binding under Kansas territorial law. He further issued an injunction prohibiting Wade Calloway from approaching within a mile of Dorothy Finley or the property of Reuben Finley on pain of arrest. Calloway left Harlan's Crossing the following week. Nobody was entirely sure where he went, and nobody was particularly invested in finding out. On the day the ruling came down, standing outside the courthouse in haze in the thin December sunlight with their breath making small clouds in the cold air, Dorothy tucked her arm through Reuben's and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "It is over." "It is over," he agreed. She lifted her head and looked at him with those clear dark eyes that had, over the past 2 months, become the thing his own eyes sought in every room he entered. "I want to tell you something," she said. "You told me something several weeks ago that I thought about for days afterward," he said. "Please go ahead." "I want to tell you that when I knocked on your door, I was frightened, and I had nothing, and I was asking for the smallest possible help. Just a place to stand that was not where I had been," she said. "And you gave me your house and your name and your time and your protection and your complete and genuine self, and I do not have the words to account for what that means to me. But I want you to know that I am not here now because I owe you anything or because I am grateful in a way that feels like obligation." She squared her shoulders the way she did when she was saying something important. "I am here because there is nowhere on earth I would rather be than in that small house on the edge of that creek with you and your mountain of books and your unreasonable coffee. And I love you, Reuben Finley. I am deeply, specifically, entirely in love with you, and I thought you should hear me say it plainly." The cold December air sat around them, and a horse nickered somewhere down the street, and the wide Kansas sky was an impossible blue overhead, and Reuben looked at Dorothy and felt something so large and so certain in his chest that it seemed unlikely his body could contain it. "I love you," he said. "I've been in love with you since Thursday of the first week, standing at the dishpan, which is a remarkably undignified place for a revelation of that magnitude, but there it is." She laughed, a full, real laugh, the best sound he had ever heard in 30 years of living, and she turned her face up to him, and he kissed her there on the courthouse steps in Hays, Kansas, in December of 1878, with the whole free world around them and nothing more to fear. Christmas that year was quiet and warm. Dorothy had taken on 2 mornings a week at the small school in Redemption Creek, teaching the older children reading and arithmetic in a way that the previous teacher, a well-meaning young man from Ohio who was somewhat out of his depth, had not been able to, and she had found in this work a satisfaction that lit her up from the inside in a way that Reuben watched with an uncomplicated joy. She was extraordinary with children, patient and demanding in equal measure, and within 3 weeks the mothers of Redemption Creek had developed an opinion of Dorothy Finley that could only be described as devoted. Reuben expanded the house in November, adding a second room off the back with the help of Henry Marsh and 2 other men from the congregation, partly because the single bedroom had become a slightly crowded arrangement, and partly because, as he explained to Henry with the particular embarrassed plainness of a man who does not know how else to say a thing, they were going to need more room before long. Henry had clapped him on the shoulder and said absolutely nothing, which was the best possible response. The town of Redemption Creek grew that winter. A family named Birch came from Ohio and settled on the north side of the creek, and a blacksmith named Tomas Guerrero arrived from Santa Fe and set up his forge at the south end of the main street and promptly became indispensable to everyone within 20 miles. Reuben's congregation expanded, and the chapel got too small for Sunday services, and there were serious discussions about building a proper church, which Reuben approached with the mixture of practical vision and theological humility that characterized everything he did. Dorothy helped him with the sermon writing. This happened gradually and naturally, beginning with her making a small observation about a passage he was working on one evening, and him asking her to elaborate, and the conversation that followed lasting 3 hours and ending with an entirely different sermon than the one he had started with, and both of them talking over each other with the bright animation of two people who have discovered that the other person's mind is one of the most interesting places they have ever been. After that, sermon preparation became a shared enterprise conducted over the kitchen table with coffee, and sometimes an argument, and always an end product that Reuben believed was better than anything he had written alone. The spring of 1879 came in slowly, melting the ice in the creek and softening the hard Kansas earth back into something ready to receive seed, and the prairie greened up in that particular way it had, seemingly all at once, as if the grass had been waiting underground for exactly the right moment to declare itself. Dorothy had begun a small kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, and she worked in it in the evenings, coming inside with dirt on her hands and her hair escaping its pins, and a quiet contentment in her face that Reuben thought was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, which was saying something, because he had seen the Rockies at sunrise. In April, Dorothy told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, setting a second cup of coffee in front of him, and then sitting down across from him and folding her hands on the table in the composed, deliberate way that he now recognized as her method of approaching things that mattered very much to her. She said it simply and clearly in the voice that never wavered, and watched his face. What happened to Reuben's face was something Dorothy would carry with her for the rest of her life as a private treasure. He was a composed man. He was accustomed to managing his expressions as a professional matter, to projecting calm when calm was required. All of that arrangement came apart simultaneously and completely, not into distress, but into a joy so unguarded and so total that it looked almost like astonishment, his brown eyes going wide and bright, and his face opening into a smile that was nothing like his usual dry, measured expression, and was instead something wholly undefended and raw and magnificent. He pushed back from the table and came around to her and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his. "Dorothy," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I know," she said. "A child," he said. "Yes." He brought her hands to his lips and held them there for a moment, his forehead bowed, and she felt the slight tremor in his hands and understood that this enormous quiet man was undone by joy, which was perhaps the loveliest thing she had ever been a witness to. He raised his head. "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise fine." She smiled at him with her whole face. "You are going to be a wonderful father." He looked at her for a moment with everything visible. "I love you so much," he said, in the simple, direct way that had stopped surprising her only recently, because he said things exactly as he meant them and meant them with his whole self, every time. "I love you more than I know how to say," which is a considerable limitation for a man who writes sermons for a living. She laughed and leaned down and kissed him there by the kitchen table, while the spring morning came through the window in long, warm bars of light, and the birds in the cottonwood by the creek made their small, persistent arguments, and the coffee went slowly cold, and everything in the world was entirely as it ought to be. The summer of 1879 in Redemption Creek was long and warm and full. Reuben and the congregation broke ground on the new church in June, a proper building with a bell tower that would hold 200 people, and had been designed with input from half the town in a series of meetings that had been democratic, contentious, and ultimately productive. Tomas Guerrero donated the ironwork for the Bell housing, which was beautiful, and a woman named Clara Hennessy, who had arrived from St. Louis with her merchant husband, donated a small organ that took 4 men to carry off the wagon and represented a musical ambition that Redemption Creek had not previously possessed. Dorothy taught through June and came home in the afternoons, and worked on the garden and read and argued with Reuben about theology and history, and the increasingly complicated politics of the Kansas Territory, where the question of how the land and its people should be governed was never simple and never far from the surface. They talked about everything, which was a thing Dorothy had decided was the secret of the whole enterprise: the talking, the genuine exchange between two people who respected each other's minds enough to disagree and argue and listen and change their positions when the evidence required it. She had not known a relationship like this was possible. She had thought, somewhere in the gray interior of her first marriage, that the best available outcome for a woman was a man who did not cause active harm. She had not imagined this, had not had the vocabulary for it, this particular thing that she and Reuben had together, which was a partnership of such absolute equality and such deep mutual regard that every day of it still struck her with something close to wonder. She told him this once, in the quiet of a July evening when the heat had broken and the air off the creek was cool, and they were sitting on the porch watching the prairie dark come in. He had listened and been quiet for a moment and then said, "I think the mistake most people make is treating love as something that happens to you rather than something you choose to build. Every day I choose to know you better, and every day what I find is better than what I knew before. I think that is the actual thing under all the poetry." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "For a man who claims limitations in expressing things," she said, "you occasionally say something perfect." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Do not tell anyone. It will ruin my reputation as a taciturn person." The baby arrived in October, almost exactly a year to the day from the night Dorothy had knocked on the chapel door, which was the kind of symmetry that felt like the world closing a circle it had begun in desperation and completed in joy. The labor was long and tiring but uncomplicated, attended by Edna Pratchett, who had brought more children into the world than she could count, and the doctor who rode out from Hayes, a careful young man named Willis who was new to the territory but competent and calm. Reuben was not permitted in the room, which was the custom, but he was on the other side of the door for 8 hours and nobody could persuade him to move more than 10 feet away. And when the sound of a baby's first outraged cry came through the wall, Henry Marsh, who had come to sit with him, said the minister actually put his hand flat on the wall as if trying to reach through it. Edna opened the door 20 minutes later and said, "You have a son, Reuben Finley, a large, loud, extremely healthy son." Reuben walked into the room, and Dorothy was propped against the pillow looking thoroughly exhausted and completely radiant in the way that women do at that particular moment, and she was holding a small, red-faced, bundled person who was observing the world with an expression of deep suspicion that Reuben recognized immediately as his own. "Come here," Dorothy said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time with the care of a man holding something irreplaceable, which is exactly what it was, and looked at the small, fierce face, and felt something so enormous that it had no name except everything. "He looks like you already," Dorothy said. "God help him," Reuben said softly, and Dorothy laughed, and the baby opened his eyes at the sound, dark and new and watching. They named him Thomas James Finley after both their fathers. Thomas, for Dorothy's father Thomas Doyle, the Iowa schoolteacher who had filled their house with books and taught his daughter that her mind was the best thing she owned. James, for Reuben's father James Finley, the Missouri farmer who had taught him that stubbornness in the service of something worth having was a virtue rather than a flaw. The first time Reuben brought Thomas into the chapel, 6 weeks old and wide awake, and regarding the proceedings with magnificent indifference. Half the congregation came to look at him after the service and the other half came before. And Dorothy stood at the back of the room and watched her husband hold their son, and accept the congratulations of the people he had served for 3 years, and felt a fullness so complete that she could not think of a single additional thing to want. Edna Pratchett came to stand beside her and followed her gaze to Reuben across the room, who was at that moment having an earnest conversation with Thomas about the merits of the new church bell, which Thomas was considering skeptically. "Look at him," Edna said, with the satisfaction of someone watching a long-held belief be confirmed. "I look at him quite regularly," Dorothy said. Edna laughed. "He waited a long time for this," she said. "Before you came, he was a good man and a good pastor, but there was something very solitary about him. Not lonely exactly, or not only. More like a man who had decided that certain kinds of happiness were not for him and made his peace with it." She looked at Dorothy. "You ended that." Dorothy considered this. "He ended something for me too," she said. "Something I had nearly stopped believing was possible." "That is what the good ones do," Edna said simply, and patted her arm and went to find more cake. The new church was dedicated in November of 1879, on a cold, clear Sunday with the whole town present and a light snow that began falling during the final hymn, as if the sky had decided to participate. The bell rang for the first time, and the sound of it went out across the prairie in every direction, clear and resonant. And several people in the congregation, who were not generally given to being moved by architecture or ceremony, found something happening behind their eyes that they would not entirely account for. Reuben delivered the dedication sermon and Dorothy sat in the front pew with Thomas asleep against her shoulder, and the whole congregation around her. These people of Redemption Creek who had become her community and her daily world. And she listened to her husband's voice moving through the new space with its clean wooden walls and its winter light coming through the plain glass windows. And the sermon was about building, as she had known it would be, about what it meant to build a thing that would outlast you. A structure that would shelter people you would never meet. And she thought about what he had said on the porch in July about choosing to build something every day. And she thought about all the forms that building took, houses and churches and marriages and lives. And she held her sleeping son and let the sermon wash over her and felt, with the complete certainty of a person who has found the thing they were looking for, that she was home. After the service and the celebration in the yard of the new church, with hot cider and cornbread and half the town talking at once in the cold afternoon air, Reuben found her near the fence with Thomas awake now and staring at the sky with the interested expression he wore when something was new to him. "Hello, Mrs. Finley," he said. "Hello, Mr. Finley," she said. "That was a very good sermon. You helped write it." "I made some small suggestions." "You rewrote the entire second section," he said, "which was, I fully admit, the best part." She laughed and shifted Thomas to her other arm and looked up at her husband in the November light, this man who had opened a door at midnight and never once made her feel that doing so had been anything other than a privilege. "Are you happy?" she asked him. Reuben Finley looked at his wife and his son, and the new church behind them, and the town that had grown up around his small chapel, and the prairie that went out to the horizon in every direction, that vast American landscape that had seemed to him, once, like the only thing large enough to contain his faith. He thought about a night 2 years ago when a woman had knocked on his door in the dark and asked for sanctuary, and how he had given her his house and his name before the morning was done, not knowing it would change everything, only knowing it was the right thing to do. "I am," he said simply. "Completely. Are you?" "Yes," Dorothy said. "In every particular." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Thomas grabbed a fistful of Reuben's coat with determined infant authority and held on. And the snow that had begun during the hymns had stopped, and the air was sharp and cold and bright. And Redemption Creek lay around them in the late afternoon quiet, waiting to be lived in for all the years to come. And they did live in it, fully and well and together, With all the ordinary pleasures and small difficulties and deep satisfactions of a life shared between two people who had chosen each other in the most complicated of circumstances, and found that what they had built on that foundation was something rare and absolutely solid. Thomas grew into a boy who had his mother's mind and his father's stubbornness, and his grandmother Edna Pratchett's tendency to offer unsolicited assessments of situations, which made him beloved by some people and slightly exasperating to others, and which both his parents found endlessly entertaining. 2 years after Thomas came Margaret, named for Reuben's mother, a small, determined girl who learned to read at 4 and by 6 had opinions about every book in the house and was not shy about expressing them, and who from her earliest days had the quality of paying absolute full attention to whatever she was looking at, a quality both her parents recognized and found deeply familiar. The school grew too. Dorothy was teaching full days by 1880 and had 3 students who were particularly gifted, and who she pushed with the same generous, demanding rigor her father had applied to her, and 2 of them eventually went on to college, which in Kansas Territory in 1880 was an achievement that required fighting for on their behalf, a fight Dorothy conducted with complete willingness and absolute effectiveness. Reuben built on more rooms as the family grew, and the small house that had been the single point of sanctuary on a midnight in October of 1878 became a large, comfortable home that was always full of people and books and conversation, and the noise of children and the smell of coffee and wood smoke. And at the center of it always, like a compass fixed to true north, was the partnership between Reuben and Dorothy Finley, which only deepened as the years went by, which grew more layered and more alive with each passing season, which remained, as he had once described it, a thing they chose to build every single day. Henry Marsh came to dinner every Sunday and maintained into his 70s that Reuben's Sunday roast was the best food available within 30 miles, which was almost certainly not true, but which Henry said with such consistent conviction that it became a kind of beloved local fiction. Tomas Guerrero married a woman named Adela who came to visit her brother in Redemption Creek, and decided she would rather stay. And the Guerrero and Finley families became the kind of friends whose lives braid together so completely that it becomes impossible to imagine the town without both of them. Wade Calloway was heard of once more in the spring of 1881, when a letter arrived from a circuit court judge in Colorado informing Reuben that Calloway had attempted to make a legal claim of some kind connected to the Kansas proceedings and had been denied on every point. After that, nothing. He passed out of the story entirely, unmourned and unremarkable, the way certain chapters of a life do when better chapters have made them irrelevant. The prairie remained the prairie, enormous and various and indifferent to small human concerns in the most beautiful possible way, and the seasons moved over it in their ancient order, summer into autumn, into winter, into spring. And in the spring the grass came up green and full of motion in the wind, and the creek ran clear and bright, and the bell of the Redemption Creek church rang on Sunday mornings and sent its voice out across the open land in all directions like a declaration. One evening in the fall of 1882, 4 years after the night Dorothy had knocked on the door in the dark, Reuben was at his desk working on a sermon when she came to lean in the doorway with Thomas, now 3, asleep against her shoulder, and Margaret, now 1, settled on her hip, and she watched him for a moment in the lamplight before he noticed her, his head bent over his notebook and his thumb running absently along the edge of the open Bible beside it, wearing its small groove in the pages. He looked up and saw her. "I was thinking about the night I knocked on your door," she said. He set down his pen. "What about it?" "I have been thinking about what it cost you," she said. "At the time I was too frightened to think about anything clearly, but looking back, you took on an enormous amount of trouble and risk on behalf of someone you had never met. Your reputation, your standing in the community, the legal complications, all of it. None of it was a cost," Reuben said. "It was, though," she said gently. "I want you to know that I know that." And I want you to know that I have thought about it many times and I am grateful, not in the way that feels like debt. I got past that a long time ago, but in the way that feels like wonder, that you would do that." Reuben looked at her across the room, this woman with her dark eyes and her composure and her fierce, precise mind, holding their children in the lamplight of the home they had built together, 4 years and everything. "Do you know what I thought about?" he said. "On the night you knocked. Tell me." "I thought that the door I was opening was the most important door I had ever opened in my life," he said. "Not because I knew you, but because the asking required something, and the right answer to that kind of asking is always yes." He paused. "And then I met you, and understood that the door had led somewhere I had not known I was looking for, and that the asking and the answering had been, in some way I am not entirely able to articulate, exactly right." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, and the small smile arrived and widened into the full, real one, the one that had undone him on a Friday morning in October 4 years ago and had continued to undo him every time since. "You managed to say something perfect again," she said. "Do not tell anyone," he said. She laughed and Thomas stirred at the sound of it and settled back against her shoulder, and Margaret watched her father from her mother's hip with calm, observant eyes, and the lamplight was gold and warm across everything. And outside the window the autumn wind came off the Kansas prairie carrying the smell of dry grass and approaching rain, and the world was vast and dark and full of difficult things, as it had always been and would always be. And inside this one small lit house it was safe and warm and loved. And that was enough, that was everything, that was the whole of it. The bell rang on Sunday mornings for many years after that, and the school grew, and the children grew, and the house grew with them, room by room, season by season, built with the same care and patience and daily choosing with which Reuben Finley had built everything worth having in his life. And Dorothy Finley, who had walked out of darkness and knocked on a door and asked for the smallest possible thing, lived every day of the life she found behind it with the full and deliberate appreciation of a woman who knew exactly what it meant to have found it, and who chose, every morning, to be grateful. The creek ran beside the house through all the seasons, clear in the spring, low and warm in the summer, quick and copper-colored under the October trees, frozen and silver in January, and in the sound of it always something like continuity, something like the world keeping its word. And the door on the small white house at the edge of Redemption Creek was never locked against anyone who needed to knock on it. Not once, not ever, for as long as Reuben and Dorothy Finley lived there together, which was a very long time and a very good one, from the first midnight hour of it to the very last long golden afternoon.